Sabah al-Khair, good morning, dear listeners. You're listening to Radio 3CR on 855 AM and Palestine Remembered with Robert Martin, Nasser Mashni and Yusuf Ahmed al-Rimawi.
Palestine Remembered is Australia's only English-language radio program that is totally dedicated to Palestine. We'd like to welcome those listening on 855 and those that will join us on podcast at 3cr.org.au.
Thanks for joining us. Stay with us and enjoy the episode.
Bringing you the news and views and the untold side of the Palestinian struggle for freedom from a Palestinian perspective. Good morning, Rob. How are you?
Mate, I'm really well, Nasser. I'm on school holidays, having a ball with my kids, so I'm fantastic. How are you?
Rocking and rolling, mate. Rocking and rolling. Rob, this morning we're joined by Professor Jake Lynch, who is a fantastic friend of Palestine, a fantastic friend of both you and I. He's a journalist, an academic, a writer, and patron of BDS Australia. Welcome. Good morning, Jake.
Morning, both. How's it going? Very well.
Jake, a lot of our listeners will remember you from your case, your time as an academic, when you refused to, why don't you tell us a story?
Well, yes, it really begins with Operation Cast Lead, which people will recall fell in the period between Christmas and New Year of 2008-9. And of course, it was a massive shock, massive act of brutality, a kind of cynical disregard of international law and humanitarian law, and I think spurred a lot of us into renewed action to extend our solidarity to the struggle of the people of Palestine. And in the university, we convened a quite well-attended public meeting some months afterwards to figure out what we could do. And we were apprised of the fact that Sydney Uni has these institutional links with Israeli higher education. So there are these bilateral funded fellowship schemes with the Technion University Haifa and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And so we, as a result of that meeting, we got signatories, we called on the Sydney Uni Vice Chancellor to revoke those arrangements. Of course, he refused to do so. But then a little while later, I myself was approached by somebody from the Hebrew University, this guy, Professor Dan Avnon, asking me to sign his application for one of these fellowships, because you have to name a few researchers at the destination end that you're going to work with. So I wrote back saying, nothing against you, old chap, Dan, but I won't do that because my policy is to support the Palestinian call for the academic boycott of Israel. So that was pretty much that for a while. And then the whole issue, well, the only way to put it is it erupted onto the front page of Murdoch's Australian newspaper, fitted in well with their obsessions at the time. And they kept on, for several successive days. At one point, a spokesperson for Sydney Uni told them that Professor Lynch has been told before that his views are inappropriate. So, of course, that was a massive red flag. Big shout out to my union, the NTEU, who came, straight to my side demanding a retraction, because, of course, that's a straight out violation of my intellectual freedom provided for in the enterprise agreement and so on. So that then also came and went. And then a little while later, I received a letter from this guy, Andrew Hamilton, asking me to revoke all my previous commitments and apologize to Dan Avnon and abandon my support for BDS, or I would face a referral to Australia's Human Rights Commission because I was in breach of the Race Relations Act and the Human Rights Act. So I said, well, no, I absolutely will not back down in any way, shape or form. So with that, we were set on a collision course at Australia's Federal Court. And it was a strange case, really. Throughout, I was at pains to emphasize that, again, I had nothing against this guy, Dan Avnon. I think at one point I used to go around saying to people, man could be a Buddhist from Bendigo, as far as I'm concerned. It's the institutional links with the Israeli university that I object to. And he assembled a motley cast list of fellow complainants. So, for example, they included one person from Israel who reckoned to be a fan of Elvis Costello. And some years earlier, Elvis Costello had said, I won't tour Israel because, shall I do the accent? It will be a political act, as he put it. And I was somehow to blame for this. So visions of me on the hotline to Elvis Costello's studio, sort of convincing him not to tour Israel. But as part of the BDS movement, they said I was instrumentally responsible for the disappointment of this person that they couldn't see Elvis Costello live. So yeah, I mean, really speaking, I suppose the overall theme of it was that it's an object lesson, I think, in how these allegations get thrown around. You know, I was said to be being anti-Semitic. Okay, lots of people are called anti-Semitic. The allegation is very seldom actually put to the test because it's not really designed to withstand the requirement to show evidence and sustain logical argument. It really is only designed to intimidate. And that proved the case with this court case because, you know, one by one, the defendants fell away as it occurred to them that there really was no substance to the case at all. We made Shurat Hadin, or we got the judge to make Shurat Hadin, the Israeli NGO behind the whole thing, pay a sum of $100,000 into the court towards our costs, and basically, you know, came away winning every argument. Yeah, we are. That's where it rested.
I think we should just point out to our listeners that Professor Jake Lynch, PhD, was actually in the peace and conflict studies. So you're pretty familiar with all of the, you know, the peace and conflict and all those sorts of things. Was it a surprise that you got hit hard by the Zionists?
Well, I sort of dragged the words peace and conflict around with me, kind of, you know, sometimes like a sort of lead weight around my ankle, because as you'll know, I mean, peace in particular has been given a thoroughly bad name by being attached to the American-sponsored peace process for the Middle East, as it were, you know. Indeed, actually, my real specialism is in peace journalism, coming from my background as a journalist. Yeah. A good friend of mine, Vanessa Bassel, started the Media Association for Peace in Lebanon to promote peace journalism. And she was relieved when it turned out that I was in favor of the academic boycott of Israel, because she was beginning to get a hard time from people saying this peace journalism, this sounds like normalization of relations with Israel. And what about this Jake Lynch? You know, he's a peace professor. So when she could say to them, well, actually, yeah, Jake Lynch is also a supporter of the academic boycott of Israel, that kind of ticked the box and solved the problem for her.
Now, Jake, as you said, it's a pernicious and it's a dirty, dirty slur to call somebody an anti-Semite. And overwhelmingly, when it gets thrown around to Palestinians and advocates for justice for the Palestinians, it invariably falls nowhere, as evidenced by your success. How do you think you would have gone if your university had adopted the IHRA, not just definition, but all of the working examples, how that might have been? How would that fit in with an enterprise agreement moving forward?
That's a very good question. I mean, let's say, first of all, you know, let's deal with the most egregious of these examples. I mean, it's reckoned to be anti-Semitic to call Israel a racist endeavor. What? You know, our Nakba was not incidental, mate, but foundational to the state of Israel, clearing out people from their homes and communities because they were of the wrong race. They're earmarked for people of a different race. If that's not a racist endeavor, what is? You know, so it's completely absurd. Now, I mean, the uni took pains to distance itself from my case, as you might expect. In fact, actually, at one point, the judge suggested we'd better have the Dean of Arts and Social Sciences, who is Jake's boss, in this court answering these charges. And, you know, knowing the person concerned, I could imagine him turning pale beneath his suntan at the prospect. But yeah, I mean, if unis adopt this IHRA definition, clearly it would be, you know, an infringement of our intellectual freedom. Let's put it like this: there'd be a very long queue of us wanting to put that to the test by deliberately infringing. When I go around infringing the IHRA definition, you know, when I get a chance, I make a speech and I say to people, I'll give you a warning, I'm about to infringe the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and then I go ahead and do it. So yeah, I suppose I'm kind of trying to put that to the test, and if it was brought in as a viper to the bosom of Australian universities, then yeah, we would have to kick back very hard against it.
Well, because one of the challenges, as we've seen with the University of Melbourne and Sydney University, is the SRCs, the Student Representative Councils, have passed resolutions in favour of the Palestinians, supporting BDS, the right of Palestinians to organise and call for boycott, divestment and sanctions. And the pushback from Vice-Chancellor Down has been enormous.
Yeah, look, I mean, speaking frankly, Sydney Uni in particular, I'll talk about Sydney Uni because I know it, its reputation locally is as the finishing school for the gilded youth of the eastern suburbs and North Shore of the prosperous bits of Sydney. And of course, things being what they are, that's home to a great many wealthy people, some of whom are Jewish people. And, unis have been, I think the peak in percentage terms of public funding of universities in this country was sometime in about the middle 1970s. So public funding has been falling away as a proportion of uni funding ever since. So they've become more reliant on donor funds. And the Vice-Chancellor, whom I mentioned a few minutes ago, Michael Spence, who was in place at the time of our meeting after Cast-led, his claim to fame really was that he managed to lever in, enormous sums of donor funds, some of which were from wealthy members of the Jewish community. In fact, actually, at one point, people who were working in the so-called advancements office of the uni, who would be dealing with enquiries from people wanting to make donations, they were equipped with a little card which had kind of set phrases that they were supposed to say to people about Jake Lynch. So if people rang up and said, I want to donate money to Sydney Uni, but I'm worried about anti-Semitic Jake Lynch, the person would have a little card saying, Mr. Professor Lynch is only one of many academics at the university and his views don't represent the university's views and so on and so forth. So, there's a very distinct kind of collective gathering in of sphincters in the corridors of university managements, the notion of alienating what they identify as potential wealthy donors. And, they're a bit of a motley crew. I mean, it's not a member of the Jewish community at all, but one of them at Sydney Uni, Michael Hintzey, he's just being upgraded from Sir Michael Hintzey to Lord Michael Hintzey in the Queen's Honours List back in the UK. And he's a major donor to Sydney Uni, and he's been unmasked in the past as being behind these kind of secretive, undeclared lobby groups trying to exert influence on the rise of British politics behind the scenes. So these donors are not necessarily,
altruistic and
clean-skinned or altruistic in every way.
Like the Ramsay Centre.
Well, quite, yes, the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilization. What was it Gandhi said about Western civilization? That would be nice.
It counts Tony Abbott amongst its patrons, doesn't it?
Well, look, I mean, Western civilization, let's just make this brief, has become synonymous with, the kind of liberal democracy that we have, in the West, which is great for us because it's built on the wealth generated in the Industrial Revolution. That was in turn enabled by the Scientific Revolution. And prominent figures in the Scientific Revolution include people like Galileo. Galileo, who was banged up under house arrest by Renaissance thugs in Italy for daring to defend the heliocentric theory of the spheres. That is, we revolve around the sun, not the other way about. So the people banging him up are the lineal political ancestors of the likes of Tony Abbott. who Tony Abbott is, coming and posing as the front man for Western civilization. Yeah. He's the kind of person who's always opposed it.
Yeah, he's got a direct lineage back to flat earthers.
Absolutely.
Now, Jake, we actually have got a copy of Professor Mark Scott's letter from University of Sydney. He sent it out to Zionist leaders and groups around Australia. I just might read just a couple of the paragraphs. Now, this letter was not called for, not asked for. It just went out to Zionist leadership group. And it says, I'm sure that you've heard that the University of Sydney Student Representative Council recently passed a motion that has caused concern amongst some of the community. I wanted to write to you to assure you that the SRC's motion does not represent the position of the University of Sydney. The University of Sydney deeply values our Jewish community members and the close ties we share with the broader Jewish community. As an institution, we do not consider the boycott, divestment, and sanctions policy appropriate. It's not a university-endorsed policy, and we remain open to and encourage links with all countries all over the world. I mean, this sort of heavy-handed stepping over the top of student unions, students with a democratic student body that chose to, with the basis of all the information before them, to pass a resolution. This is the sort of thing that's killing universities today.
Look, I mean, Yeah, you're quite right. It's just one among so many facets of where universities are being rapidly corporatized. Yes, Mark Scott was brought in from the ABC, presumably for his expertise at running large public institutions and not annoying the right wing too much. And that seems to be one of these. But look, when we apply now for research funding, for example, from the Australian Research Council, we have to make a statement of national interest, how the research will advance national interest, not public interest. That's a different thing. And we have to show how the research will assist in the prosperity of any one of 6 preconceived industrial sectors, one of which is the defence industry, following the decision under the Turnbull government to adopt the defence industry as a big source of export earnings for Australia. So university researchers really are being corralled into the production of widgets when their role really should be to enable and spread critical thinking. Now, that's not surprising under the coalition. We expect no better from them. If Labour really took enough of a step back from this, surely they would realise we're having a progressive moment in Australia. One of the wellsprings of that progressive moment is the large numbers of people who have learned critical thinking by their passage through Australian universities. So if we lose that remit, where will the Labour majorities of 2040, 2050 and 2060 come from? So if I was them, that's how I'd be thinking.
Moving on from there, Jake, we've had an election, had a change of government. Australia in the past hasn't been very good about Palestine. There's a little bit of talk, but not a lot of action. Where do you see things changing from here? Do you see anything changing?
Well, one of the most promising signs, of course, was when Labour's conference last year decided to recognise a Palestinian state as, and I quote, an important priority. Now, it falls in the foreign affairs remit, of course, and since they've got in, Penny Wong has had to be racking up the air miles, going around attending to the crisis in the Pacific. They also need to recognise that there is a crisis in Palestine, because all the indicators are going the wrong way. So I'm sure your listeners will be impatient. I'm certainly impatient to know when the priority becomes important enough to get to the top of Penny Wong's desk. Okay, so that will be significant in a number of ways. And one of them might pertain to the now stalled investigation by the International Criminal Court into violations of the Geneva Conventions. Because under the previous government, when that came up, I think back end of last year, Maurice Payne said, we don't agree with the ICC's remit here because we don't recognise the state of Palestine. So in other words, the refusal to recognise Palestine was a kind of political hidey hole for the coalition. So they could say, we don't even have to assess the ICC investigation on its merits. We don't even meet that threshold because we don't think it's got a mandate because we don't recognise Palestine. So if Labour do recognise Palestine, then that particular hidey hole will be closed off. One has to hope that at some point, the ICC will be able to lift its eyes from what's happening in Ukraine and get back to the Palestinians. And when it does, surely the main or one of the main items on that agenda will be the line in the 4th Geneva Convention, which says an occupying power must not move any part of its population onto the territory it occupies. So all those Jewish-only colonies, or settlements as they're called, should be seen as illegal and a war crime. And that's the seismic implication of that situation. I'm sure that's one of the reasons why it's been stalled, but one has to hope that sometime over the next 3 years, enough pressure will build to get it back on track again. And when that happens, if Labour by then has recognised Palestine, then it will have to at least engage with the substance and the subject of that ICC investigation. So that might be one of the direct implications of it.
As you said, Jake, the resolution that's now been passed twice in 2 national conferences calls on the next Labor government to recognise the state of Palestine and expects that this issue will be an important priority, close quotes. We get to that point, they do recognise the state of Palestine, then suddenly that has to trigger and necessarily changes the language with respect to the ICC and necessarily with respect to settlements and how they're seen. beyond that, how would you imagine, in a best case, Jake Lynch is head of DFAT, what's that policy look like?
Well, I think it means that Australia would join, what is it now, approximately 2/3 of the international community.
139 countries now.
We are even more then. I'm out of date. The overwhelming majority of the international community in recognising the state of Palestine. And if the implications are followed through in terms of the ICC investigation, then these really all need to be seen as interim steps towards ending the division of Palestine, or one might say obviating the division of Palestine, because the purpose of dividing Palestine is to attempt to throw a rope around it, or throw a rope around some of it, and within that rope there will be a permanent guaranteed Jewish majority and descendancy. So obviating it would mean supporting what is also the settled will of the international community, the right of return for Palestinians, which is fundamental to peace with justice. There will not be peace without justice, and that is a fundamental precept of justice. And it's got to be, to me, in the context of a regime which is capable of underpinning a high level of guaranteed rights for all citizens, regardless of their race, religion, heritage, or background. If you look wider, really the whole region has had a very difficult time in our modern distinctive system of competitive nation states. And it was when states were being formed, the states we recognize around the world today were being formed, like Italy was formed in its present condition, Germany. It's at that time in the late 19th century that Zionism begins to be iterated, not as a spiritual destiny, but as literally meaning a patch of ground on the surface of the earth. So that's just one of the many problems bequeathed to the people of the wider, what we might call Southwest Asian region or Middle East region, by this system of competitive nation states. And one of their distinctive characteristics is the hardened border, the guards, the passports, etc. And really the long-term vision for my money is that the model to emulate is the one part of the Earth's surface where those borders have least salience, and that is the 27-country Schengen zone. So you can travel between, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, without stopping and without showing your passport. And it's quite striking to me how often I've listened to Palestinians visioning about the future, and they talk about being able to travel from, to have breakfast on the shores of Lake Tiberias, and then get to Aleppo in time for an Aleppo grill for dinner and that kind of thing. And really that vision depends on weakening the salience of borders, not only the borders enforced by Israel's illegal occupation at the moment, but borders more broadly across the region. And the Schengen system is only possible because they all share a commitment to the same high level of guaranteed individual rights. And that's got to be the bedrock, I think, of a brighter future for all the people of the region.
Just quickly before we finish up, BDS is being successful. I would imagine that you would agree with that. Why should we boycott Israel? Why should we do it?
Well, I think it's because really the onus passes to us. As we know, governments are so reluctant to act. One of the, we were talking about the IRA definition of anti-Semitism earlier. One of its examples is reckoned to be holding Israel to a higher standard than other countries. Well, all the standards we're talking about are to do with international law and international humanitarian law. So by definition, they should be upheld by responsible governments. Unfortunately, governments shy away from their responsibilities, so the onus passes to the rest of us in civil society. And what we're really aiming to do, I think, with BDS is to wage a struggle over legitimacy. And we have to drain that occupation of its legitimacy. And that's where BDS, I think, has a role to play. I listened to a speech a few years ago in Oxford. There was a week of solidarity with the Palestinians in Oxford a few years ago. And one of the speakers was Mustafa Barghouti of the Red Crescent Society. He gave the opinion that the only reason the Palestinians have not, Palestinian leadership has not publicly disavowed the so-called two-state solution as envisaged in innumerable kind of Oslo Accords and peace plans, etc., is because they would immediately then lose legitimacy because they would be portrayed as enemies of peace. But actually, really, everybody knows it would be impossible to implement because of the facts on the ground. Really, you're talking about one regime with guaranteed equal rights for all citizens. And that puts it in the same basket as the South Africans. When South Africans were struggling against apartheid, their demand was one person, one vote, equality before the law. And that they are demands which can mobilize a campaign around the issue of legitimacy. And that's where BDS has a role to play.
Yeah, brilliantly said, Jake. With respect to our occupiers, our oppressors, the Israelis, the thought of equality being anathema to and not a solution to peace speaks to the racism, the foundational racism of Zionism. There was no other outcome for settler colonialism privileging a person over another person purely based on color, creed, etc.
Yep, and hence the striking contiguity that people have often remarked on between the Zionist nostrum of a land without people for a people without a land, and the British construction of terra nullius for Australia, under which Australia's First Nations were classified as part of the fauna and flora of our own land. And yes, I mean, Zionism has been in its kind of territorial iteration, has been a distinctively colonial projection. I just read a perceptive thesis, actually, from a Palestinian writer from Western Sydney University, which draws attention to how the Israelis invariably portray such episodes as their attacks on Gaza as exceptional. So they're always portrayed as exceptional circumstances which justify an exceptional departure from the high civilized standards of the colonial power. And therefore, that's why, you know, we must have an episode of unrestrained brutality before we can go back to our normal civilized behavior. So that's the kind of rhetorical cloaking that always takes place around those episodes.
Any final thoughts or words you'd like to share with us, Jake?
Yeah, let's all hope Labour does the right thing. What if they don't? You know, I mean, the next major electoral test will be the state elections in Victoria and New South Wales. The New South Wales one is in March next year. Of course, you know, it's a different matter. It's a different kind of set of issues at state level. But a lot of these issues do accrue at state level. You know, it's in state parliaments that the IRA definition has been discussed, for example. Now, there are one or two electorates in Sydney's West where the Labour vote is, as they say, not so much counted as weighed, because colossal Labour majorities. And among their most loyal voters are many people of Palestinian heritage and also heritage of the broader Arab world. And they are, and Muslim communities, they are understandably concerned when they see increasing incursions into the precincts of the Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem, cutting off access for prayer at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, issues such as this. One of these electorates is Bankstown. So I attended a rally at Bankstown to protest about the restrictions on movements at Al-Aqsa Mosque. This was back in April. It so happens that Bankstown in the state parliament is represented by one of these Labour members who never utters a peep about Palestine. Tanya Mihailuk, she's called. Now, I've got a gleam in my eye that if time grinds on and we still hear nothing from federal Labour about recognising a Palestinian state, I might put myself up as a Justice for Palestine candidate.
Magnificent.
You've got only optional preferential voting at state level, so that could actually do some damage. Something's got to tilt the calculus here. You know, Labour have got to realise you can't just keep stum on this and opt for a quiet life. You know, you're going to pay a price at the ballot box.
Beautiful.
Brilliant. What a great way for us to finish. Professor Jake Lynch, journalist, activist, writer, academic, general all-round superstar. Fantastic to have you on. Thanks so much, Jake.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Jake.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to share the podcast, tell your friends, and remember, there's never been a better time for a free Palestine.